So now we had a look at getStaticProps and getStaticPaths. And these two are working together. You don't always need both. In the case of index.js, we only needed getStaticProps. But for dynamic pages that should be pre-generated, you do need both. Now, you might recall that earlier in this module, at the beginning of this course section, I showed you this slide and I referred to two forms of pre-rendering: static generation and server-side rendering. Now, what we had a look at thus far, that's static generation, because we statically pre-generate pages. Even though it's not fully static because of incremental static generation, which I also explained, but generally pages are pre-generated. And that is really important. Inside of getStaticProps and also inside of getStaticPaths, we don't have access to the actual request which is incoming, because these functions are not called for the actual request, at least not only. With incremental static generation, they are also called for incoming requests, at least sometimes if they need to be revalidated, but they are generally called when your project is built. So inside of getStaticProps, you don't have access to the actual incoming request. Now, very often, you also don't need access. For example, here, in the examples I showed you thus far, we don't need access to the actual request which is reaching the server. But sometimes static generation is not enough, and instead you need real server-side rendering. Which means that you do need to pre-render a page for every incoming request. So not at most every second, but really for every incoming request, and or you need access to the concrete request object that is reaching the server, because, for example, you need to extract cookies. And that is something we're also going to see later in the course when we talk about authentication, but I already want to introduce you to real server-side rendering here. The idea is simple. Next.js also supports this run real server-side code use case, which means it gives you a function which you can add to your page component files, which is then really executed whenever a request for this page reaches the server. So that's then not pre-generated in advance during build time or every couple of seconds, but it's really code that runs on the server only, so only after you deployed it, and which is then re-executed for every incoming request. And that code is added to a function called getServerSideProps. Just like getStaticProps, it's an async function, it needs to be called exactly like this, and it needs to be exported. And you can only add it to your page component files. But then if you do have such a function in a page component file, Next.js will execute that function, and it will execute it whenever a request for this page is made. And therefore, you should only use either getStaticProps, what we saw thus far, or getServerSideProps, because they kind of clash. They fulfill the same purpose, they get props for the component, so that Next.js is then able to render that component, but they run at different points of time.